in this video we'll learn how to find out the zeros of a function, or we can also say that how to find out the roots of a function. So I have the function here, f of x is equal to x squared minus 5x minus 6. And I have to find the zeros of this function. Now, what do you mean by it? First of all, it's important to know what do you mean by the zeros of a function. Zeros of a function are nothing but the x-intercepts of that function. So here, if you see this graph, see this parabola, x-intercepts are these 2 points, this point and this point where the graph is crossing the x-axis. So x-intercepts are the points where the graph is crossing the x-axis, and they're called zeros of the function. So I can say the zeros of the function here. So I can say that this point is x comma 0, and the same thing is here, x comma 0. Now, what do you notice here? That the y coordinates of both the zeros are 0. And that is not a coincidence. That will happen every single time. Whenever the graph crosses the x-axis, whenever the parabola crosses the x-axis, at that point, the y coordinate is always 0. So the zeros of the function are, there's some value of x which will make your make your y value 0. So it's some value of x which will make your y value 0. So I can say that f of x is nothing but y. I can rewrite f of x as y is equal to x squared minus 5x minus 6. Now, to find the x-intercept of this function, to find the zeros of this function, or we can say roots of this function, to find the zeros of this function, I have to set y equals 0. Then I'll get the x-intercepts of this function. So I can set this as y equals 0, and then I can write this function again, x squared minus 5x minus 6. Now, typically, we write the equation on the left-hand side. So let's rewrite this as x squared minus 5x minus 6 is equal to 0. Now, this quadratic function is in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. And let's identify a, b, and c's. So a is the coefficient of x squared. Here in this function, the coefficient of x squared is 1. So I can write a is equal to 1. B is the coefficient of x, which is negative 5. And c is the constant term, which is negative 6 in our case. Now, we have to factor this equation, and we call it AC method. We use AC method to factor it. And this, what we do is we multiply the first term, which is a, with the last term, which is c. So we'll multiply these two terms. A is 1 and c is negative 6. So a times c is going to be negative 6. Okay. Now, when we factor this equation, we have to think of two factors, which when multiplied to give me AC, which is negative 6. So I need to think of two factors which when multiplied to give me negative 6. But when I add those two factors, I should get the middle term, which is negative 5. Middle term is negative 5, which is our B. So again, I'm repeating that. I have to think of two factors which when multiplied to give me the product of the first and last term, which is AC. In our case, it's negative 6. And then I have to think of the same. Those factors have to be same. Like say this is 2, this is going to be 2. If this is 3, then this is going to be 3. Okay. So the factors has to be same. I have to think of the factors which when added to give me negative 5, which is the middle term. Now let's write down the factors of 6. Well, I'm just ignoring the signs for a bit. We'll figure out what will be the sign of our factors. But right now I'm just writing the factors of 6. So I know that 2 times 3 will be equal to 6, or 1 times 6 will be equal to 6, and that's it. These are the factors of 6. Now, I have to think which one will fit in here in both the cases. So if I take this 2 and 3, I'm not looking at the sign right now. Now, let's see if I take 2 and 3, 2 times 3 is 6. Good. And then 2 plus 3 will be 5, but it will not be negative 5, right? It will not be negative 5. If I add 2 and 3, I will not get negative 5. Then if I say, let's say if 2 and 3 are the factors, okay, now the signs come into the picture. If I say that, let's say this is negative 2 and this is negative 3, and when we add negative 2 and negative 3, we get negative 5. Then this also has to be negative 2 and negative 3. So if I write here negative 2, if I write here negative 2 and negative 3, this is true. Negative 2 plus negative 3 is going to be negative 5. But if I write here negative 2 and negative 3, is this true? No, this is not true, because negative 2 times negative 3 is not equal to negative 6. That means 2 and 3 will not fit in here. These are the wrong ones, okay? So I'm just crossing this out. Okay, then let's move to this one. Now 1 times 6 is going to be 6, and then 1 plus 6 or 6 minus 1 could be 5. Now let's say 1 times 6 will be 6. Now the negative sign comes into the picture. Here I have negative 6. When do I get the product of two numbers as a negative number? I get the product of two numbers as negative when one of the factors is negative. That means either 1 has to be negative or negative 6, or 6 has to be negative. So let's figure out which one is negative out of these two. And then I have negative 5 here. So if I say, let's say, if 1 is negative, okay, if 1 is negative, then negative 1 plus 6, because my 6 is positive. Is this true? Negative 1 plus 6 is negative 5. Is this true? No, this is not true. This one is still true because negative 1 times 6 will be negative 6, but this one is false because negative 1 plus 6 will not be negative 5. It will be positive 5. So that means 1 cannot be negative. If 1 cannot be negative, that means 6 has to be negative. So we can write that 1 times negative 6 will be equal to negative 6, which is true. And then 1 plus negative 6 will be equal to negative 5. That means the factors will be 1 and negative 6. So what I'm going to do is I'll write the factors as 1 and negative 6, but how do I write it? I'll write x first inside the parentheses. Since my 1 is positive, I'll write here plus 1. And then again, I'll close the parentheses and then opening the parentheses again because I have to write the other factor, x. Now this factor is negative 6. I'll write here negative 6. And then I have this thing equal to 0. Okay. Now I have to use the zero product property, which says that if the product of two quantities is equal to 0, then one of them has to be 0. Now let's take an example of this. 4 times 0 is going to be 0. Why is it 0? Because one of them is 0, right? So the product of these two quantities is 0 because one of them is 0. The same thing will happen here. The product of these two quantities is 0. That means one of them has to be 0. So we need to figure out which one is 0. So either this one will be 0 or this one will be 0. So let's set them equal to 0. So x plus 1 is equal to 0 and x minus 6 is always also equal to 0. Now we'll be solving these equations for x. I'm subtracting 1 on both sides. This will be 0, and then x is equal to 0 minus 1 will be negative 1. And the same thing we'll do here is to eliminate negative 6, I can add 6 on both sides here. This will go away. X is equal to 6. That means my zeros of this function are negative 1 comma 6. So I can write that the zeros of this function are negative 1, and then the y coordinate will be 0. And then here, this will be 6 comma 0. And we can always verify if these answers are correct or not. What we can do is we can plug in the value of x into the original function to check. Now let's say if we plug in the value here. So let's say first of all, I'm plugging negative 1 into my function. So this is going to be f of negative 1. So I'm plugging negative 1 into my original function. And this will be x squared is going to be, I'm replacing x with negative 1 here. So this will be negative 1 squared minus 5 times negative 1 minus 6. And my function should be equal to 0 because my y is 0 when I'm finding the roots of the function, right? My y is always 0. So the y coordinate is 0. So this will be 0. So I should get 0 instead of all this. So negative 1, let's see, negative 1 squared is going to be positive 1. And then negative 5 times negative 1 will be positive 5. And then I have minus 6. And 1 plus 5 is going to be 6. And 6 minus 6 is equal to 0. That means my answer is correct. That means this value, this is the 0 of this function. Now we can also substitute 6 into the original function to check if that is correct. So let's substitute x equals 6 here. So this will be 6 squared minus 5 times. Now I'm just plugging in the value of x in the original function. 5 times 6 minus 6 into this function, okay? Now 6 squared will be 36 minus 5 times 6 will be 30 and then minus 6. So 36 minus this 30 will be 6 and 6 minus 6 will be 0. And that's all we need because f of 6 is nothing but 0. So that means the final answer, the roots of this function are x is equal to negative 1 and x is equal to 6. And we have also verified this. This step is not mandatory, But just to check our answer, if the zeros of this function are correct or not, we can do this step. That's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next video.